Mama, sorry.
Who raising your kids?
Me and my mom and dad.
You ain't raising shit. You on here in your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm gonna keep you about a week.
Hello, before diving into today's story, I just want to say that this video is intended for education, awareness, and entertainment. Please remember to always treat others kindly in your daily life. Now, if you haven't followed Mysterious Case yet, hit like, subscribe, so you don't miss the upcoming cases. In the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, where the Mississippi River winds through bustling streets, Maury Travis was born on October 25, 1965. At first glance, Maury's life seemed unremarkable. He grew up in an impoverished slum where dilapidated houses and pothole-ridden roads were familiar sights. His family scraped by day to day, so details about Maury's childhood remain as hazy as a fog. No one clearly recalls what kind of child he was, except for one teacher who vaguely remarked that the boy was unusual, a fleeting comment that carried an ominous hint of what was to come. In 1985, at age 20, Maury graduated high school and stepped into the world with a flicker of hope. He joined the military reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant for 2 years. Later, he took on a string of odd jobs: a driver for transportation companies, a volunteer at a nursing home. On the surface, he was an ordinary man, even somewhat kind. No one suspected that beneath his polite exterior, a darkness was quietly growing. In 1987, Maury's life took a dark turn. Crack cocaine, the cheap narcotic, slithered into his life like a venomous snake. Within months, he was heavily addicted. From an honest worker, Maury became someone who spent up to $300 a day to feed his drug habit. His wages couldn't keep up, and he soon spiraled into crime. Over 8 days in 1988, he robbed 5 shoe stores across St. Louis County. His bold yet clumsy heist eventually landed him in the hands of the police. When arrested, Maury didn't resist. Officers described him as surprisingly respectful, an odd demeanor for a recent criminal. In court, he claimed the drugs had clouded his memory, that he'd lost control of himself. He begged for leniency, asserting he'd gotten clean while awaiting trial. But his words failed to sway anyone. A judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison, a verdict that seemed like it would end everything. Just 2 months later, Maury wrote a handwritten letter to the judge, pleading for reconsideration. He described prison as unbearable, saying he cried every night and his mental health was crumbling. That desperate letter fell into silence. No one replied. After more than 5 years in prison, something unexpected happened. Maury was pardoned in 1994 at the age of 29. He returned to St. Louis with a new appearance, at least on the surface. Those who met him afterward recalled a polite, humble Maury. A neighbor mentioned that he often hummed a tune while heading down to the shared basement, as if to signal his presence without startling her. Another person, who occasionally drank beer with him, said they never noticed anything strange. But behind that friendly smile and carefree humming, a monster was silently awakening. No one knows exactly what changed Maury. Did those years in prison warp his soul? Or had that darkness always been there, just waiting to erupt? Whatever it was, the summer of 2000 marked a horrific turning point. Maury Travis, once a jailed addict, now became the terror of St. Louis streets, a serial killer. In the summer of 2000, St. Louis sweltered under the humid heat typical of the American Midwest. On the rundown streets of the Stroll, where addicted, homeless women sold themselves to afford drugs, Maury Travis's figure began to appear. With disheveled hair and a cold gaze, he quietly blended into the crowd. But no one suspected he wasn't there for services. He was there to hunt. Maury's victims were often African-American women, transients with no one to rely on. They were society's ghosts, forgotten, vulnerable, and unnoticed if they vanished. Maury knew this well. He understood the area like the back of his hand, not just from his days as an addict wandering the streets, but because he'd studied it meticulously. He knew which corners saw little foot traffic, which spots the police rarely patrolled. East Street Louis, a desolate wasteland across the Mississippi River, became his ideal dumping ground for bodies. Maury's approach initially seemed harmless. He'd approach victims with a polite, friendly demeanor, a typical customer, smiling, chatting, even inviting them to his home in Ferguson, Missouri, with promises of free drugs. But once the door of that house closed, the mask dropped. Maury turned into a savage beast, and his ordinary home became a hell. He recorded everything. With an old camcorder, Maury filmed every moment, from the victims entering his house laughing innocently, to the instant they realized the horrific fate awaiting them. He'd give them drugs, sleep with them in the bedroom, then lead them to the living room. There, his sick ritual began. He forced them to wear white dresses and sunglasses, a bizarre detail that remains unexplained to this day. Then, when they were least guarded, he'd pull out a stun gun, delivering a powerful shock below their collarbone, knocking them unconscious instantly. From the living room, Maury dragged his victims down to the basement, what he called his torture chamber. The sound of bodies thudding against the wooden stairs echoed in the tapes later discovered by police, a wordless, distorted horror soundtrack. That basement wasn't just a room, it was Maury's private world, a place where he held absolute power over life and death. At the center of the room stood a rough wooden pole. Maury bound his victims to it, cuffing their hands and feet behind them, forcing them to kneel on the floor. He stripped them naked, turning them into utterly helpless prey. Then he began his interrogation. In a contemptuous tone, he asked who they were, who took care of their children, and made them speak their final words on camera, as if he were a self-appointed judge. He filmed it all, from their desperate pleas to their choked sobs. But that wasn't the end. For days, Maury tortured them. He beat them with his bare hands until their bodies were bruised, slashed their flesh with a knife, letting blood spray across the walls and floor. He didn't bother cleaning. The basement gradually became a gruesome tableau of dried bloodstains, scattered hair, and the stench of death. When he was finally satisfied, he strangled them with a belt or his hands, taking a keepsake, a ring, a piece of clothing, before dumping their bodies in desolate areas like East Street, Lewis, parks, or illegal trash sites. While Maury lived a double life, a cold-blooded killer by night and an ordinary man by day, those around him started to sense something was off. He worked as a waiter at a hotel restaurant in 2000 to 2001. And one day, a coworker named Dave casually mentioned that a friend's car had been stolen and burned in East St. Louis. Maury calmly replied, "The police never go there." Dave paused. How did Maury know that so well? The comment stuck with him, though at the time, Dave didn't dare think further. Meanwhile, Maury's girlfriend Julie, a news intern at KDL, also grew uneasy. Once Maury asked her, "Has your station ever reported on prostitutes being killed?" Between 2000 and 2001, several sex workers had been found dead in East Street, Lewis, and nearby areas, but the police hadn't yet released details. Julie was surprised Maury knew this. She mentioned it to her boss, who dismissed it as nonsense. It wasn't until months later, when police officially acknowledged a serial killer was active, that Julie felt a chill realizing Maury might be involved. These fleeting conversations were the first signs revealing the monster within Maury, but no one acted, and he remained free to continue his hunt. From March 19, 2000, the suspected start of his reign of terror, Maury Travis unleashed horror upon the streets of St. Louis. His victims were not just numbers on paper. They were women with tragic life stories, forgotten by society, and ultimately ensnared by a ruthless predator. Maury's death toll grew month by month. Alyssa Greenwade, 34, found on April 1, 2001, in Washington Park, her neck bore clear strangulation marks. Alyssa had lived as a transient on the Stroll, selling herself to buy drugs. Teresa Wilson, 36, her body was discovered on May 15, 2001, in a ditch off Highway 67, dead from strangulation. Teresa was the mother of a young daughter named Chastity. The child used to wait for her on a roadside bench while Teresa worked, unaware that the last time her mother left was to meet Maury. On May 23, 2001, she was found with tire marks on her legs, evidence Maury had run over her body after killing her. Betty was one of the few victims who appeared in Maury's self-recorded tapes, where she briefly stated her identity in his depraved footage. Her body was located just 16 feet from Teresa's, discovered on June 29, 2001, also strangled. Yvonne Cruz, 50. On August 25, 2001, her decomposed body was found, covered in signs of torture and strangulation. Brenda Beasley, 33. Months later, Brenda was discovered in a dumpster, her neck bearing Maury's handprints. His DNA was found in her body and Yvonne's, directly linking him to the crimes. The list didn't end there. Police believe at least 15 to 20 women died by Maury's hands, though only 12 were officially identified. The bodies were often discarded in desolate places, trash heaps, roadside thickets, or East Street. Louis, as if Maury saw them as nothing more than garbage. But the most horrifying part was that he didn't just kill. He preserved memories of each murder through tapes and keepsakes, like a twisted collector. For nearly 2 years, from 2000 to 2002, the St. Louis and Illinois police were almost powerless against an invisible killer. Every 6 weeks or so, a new body would turn up, but clues were scarce. Investigators initially suspected the culprit was a white truck driver, based on the bodies often being found along highways. But as the victim count rose, they realized the killer had to be someone intimately familiar with St. Louis, someone living right in the city's heart. The FBI and local police formed a task force, but the pressure mounted. The victims shared a pattern: African-American women, drug addicts, transients. They were the most vulnerable and the least noticed when they vanished. This emboldened Maury. At times, he left bodies in easily discoverable spots, as if taunting the police with his arrogance. But everything changed in early 2002, thanks to a fatal mistake by Maury himself. A journalist named Bill Smith, writing for a local paper, published an article about the murders, specifically mentioning Teresa Wilson. The piece was emotional, a call for justice for these forgotten women. Just 5 days later, Bill received an odd letter through the company mailbox. The first line read, "Nice job, the story about Teresa." But what followed chilled him to the bone. "Write a good one about Greenwade, and I'll tell you where another body is. To prove I'm real, here's a map." Attached was a map printed from Expedia.com, marked with an X at the location of Alyssa Greenwade's body, a victim never publicly disclosed. Bill immediately handed the letter to the task force. It was the first glimmer of hope after 2 years of groping in the dark. The police quickly realized the map in the letter had been downloaded from the internet. They assembled a team of digital forensic experts who determined it came from Expedia.com, running on a Microsoft platform. With just 5 days between the article's publication and Bill receiving the letter, they requested Microsoft provide user data for anyone who accessed a map of the St. Louis area during that window. Microsoft initially refused, but a court order compelled their cooperation. The data revealed something startling. Only one computer had downloaded that map in the 5-day time frame. The IP address traced back to an MSN account registered under the name Maury Travis. His name wasn't unfamiliar to police. He had a robbery conviction from 1988. They immediately tracked the address, a modest house in Ferguson, Missouri. On June 7, 2002, Sergeant Tom Sachs knocked on Maury's door at 7 a.m. Maury, irritated at being disturbed so early, demanded, "Why do you need to search my house?" Tom replied coolly, "You know exactly why we're here." With a search warrant in hand, the police stepped inside. When the door to the house in Ferguson, Missouri swung open on the morning of June 7, 2002, the police officers had no idea they were stepping into a monster's lair. Maury Troy Travis stood there, eyes flashing with anger, yet maintaining an eerie calm, as if he knew the game was up. Sergeant Tom Sachs and the investigative team began their search, and what they uncovered surpassed their worst nightmares. The upper floor of the house was largely unremarkable. Tidy furniture, no obvious signs of trouble, but when they opened the door to the basement, a putrid stench hit them, a mix of dried blood, sweat, and decay. Flipping on the lights, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls, ceiling, and floor were splattered with deep red bloodstains, hardened over time. Strands of hair were scattered everywhere, mingled with torn scraps of clothing. At the center of the room stood the wooden pole, the heart of the torture chamber, still bearing marks of ropes and handcuffs. The police quickly located the computer Maury had used to download the map from Expedia.com, confirming the link to the letter sent to Bill Smith. But that was just the beginning. In a desk drawer, they found a stun gun, high heels, a wig, and jewelry, items that didn't belong to Maury or his girlfriend. On a bookshelf, a manual on torture techniques sat next to clippings of news articles about missing women in the area. Then they uncovered a horrific treasure trove, a series of self-recorded videotapes hidden in a crevice in the basement wall. One tape labeled Wedding Day sent chills down the officers' spines. When they played it, they watched Maury torment a victim named Cassandra Walker. She was chained to the wooden pole, hands and feet bound, pleading for mercy. Maury, with a lifeless stare, picked up a belt, wrapped it around her neck, and tightened it until she went limp. The brutality was so extreme that several officers later sought psychological support. Another tape showed him forcing himself on and abusing victims, their terrified and desperate faces flickering across the screen. But the horror didn't end there. In a corner of the basement, police discovered detailed sketches of plans to expand the torture chamber. Maury intended to build 2 additional cells, complete with air vents and makeshift covers instead of doors to conceal them. He'd even listed supplies, adult diapers, chains, signs he planned to hold victims long-term. The realization that he'd mapped out such meticulous schemes left the investigators shuddering. Maury was interrogated right on his own sofa before being hauled off to the station. For 4 hours he sat there, emotionless, showing no remorse. When asked about the victims, he stayed silent, tapping his fingers on the table as if bored. One officer demanded, "How could you do this?" Maury smirked and replied, "How'd you find me?" This interviewer's dull brings someone more interesting. His arrogance left everyone stunned. The police revealed that the letter to Bill Smith was the clue that led them to him. At that, Maury faltered. His body grew restless, the chair shifting back and forth, but he still offered no further confession. Based on the evidence, he was arrested on charges of kidnapping 2 victims, Betty James and Alyssa Greenwade, while tire marks on Betty's legs matched his vehicle. DNA from the basement and the tapes gradually tied him to at least 12 murders, though he'd hinted the true count was 17, possibly over 20. Maury's girlfriend, Julie, was reeling from the revelation. She swore she'd never set foot in the basement. Maury had forbidden her from going near it. To her, he'd been just an ordinary man, not the cold-blooded killer living under the same roof. Maury was held at the St. Louis County Jail in a tiny cell, under constant surveillance. Guards were instructed to check on him every 15 minutes as he faced the possibility of the death penalty. But on June 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, Maury ended it all. 2 consecutive checks were missed, leaving him 45 minutes unsupervised. In that time, he tore his bed sheet, fashioned it into a noose, threaded it through the vent above the toilet, and hanged himself. He even tied his hands behind his back, preventing any instinctual struggle for survival. When the guards found him, Maury was already cold. In the cell, they discovered a note he'd written to his mother. "To Mom, I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Death is the only way out. I've been sick in the head since I was 14, never felt normal or happy. Tell Grandma Marina James and everyone that I love them, but I love you the most. Forever, your son, Maury Travis." The message didn't confess to his crimes, only hinting at a mysterious darkness from his teenage years that no one could explain. Maury's death left behind a trail of unanswered questions. What turned him into a cold-blooded killer? A hatred for transient women, or a deep psychological wound? The police would never know for sure. He departed, taking with him the secrets of his motives and the fates of victims still unfound. With 12 confirmed kills and suspicions exceeding 20, Maury Troy Travis remains an enigma, a ghost haunting saint. Lewis forever. What do you think of Maury Troy Travis? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and follow the channel so you don't miss the next cases.